Hey, imagine yourself standing beneath a pale sky. A faint breeze moves through brittle grasses, and far ahead, gently rising and dipping with the contour of the hills, lies a long weathered ribbon of stone, the Great Wall. Not the clean, restored stones of tourist photos, but the ancient uneven bones of history, softened by centuries. Tonight, we journey together not through battles or conquests, but along the slow pulse of time that shaped the Great Wall of China, of wind and mud, of tired hands and far horizons. Beyond the grandeur and away from the noise, we'll uncover the quiet truths behind one of humanity's most enduring undertakings. Not a wall of drama, but a wall of people. Let your body settle, let your breath slow. This is not a history to memorize, it is a history to drift within, to imagine, and then, perhaps, to forget. And as you settle into this soft rhythm of sound, if you enjoy quiet stories like these, consider subscribing. It helps us bring you more slow, thoughtful histories to drift off to. If you feel like it, leave a small note in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from, and what time of night or morning it is. And before you close your eyes, it's always comforting to know who else is here in the quiet. We begin not with the wall, but long before the wall traced its course along the northern ridges of China, the land itself was open-marked, not by stone or mortar, but by wind and movement. Imagine yourself thousands of years ago, standing at the edge of a forested plain where the grasses brush against your ankles like whispers, only understanding, and always, their traces lie beneath the soil, in small shards of pottery, in weathered bone, in the ghost lines of ancient fire pits. Their languages, mostly lost, carried in them names of rivers we can no longer pronounce, tales we can no longer fully recover. A hilltop might be known to one clan, a river bend might signal trade for one village, and danger for another. The gentle grunts of oxen, the soft chime of bells strung around their necks. Early city walls of rammed earth foundations, not of defense, walls to define, to make it known. Territory was remembered in stories passed from mouth to mouth, generation to generation. And when disputes arose, they were settled not with treaties to floods, and yes, at times, to raids. Not sweeping invasions, but sudden strikes fast, sharp and gone before the dust could settle. These raids weren't always bloody. Sometimes they were little more than theft. A few cattle taken, a merchant's caravan turned, a promise broken beneath the stars. But with tense silences, no roads. A man on a hill, scanning the distance for dust that might mean travelers or trouble. Only sky and instinct and rhythm, needing lines, and sometimes quiet departures. The air is still, scented faintly of pine and distant hearth smoke. The land is vast, unsettled, borderless in the way only ancient land can be. The northern frontier of what would one day be called China was not a line but a meeting place, a space where shifting groups met and mingled. Some stayed in fixed villages, harvesting millet, raising pigs, and grinding grains into flour with stones passed from hand to hand. Others rode with the rhythm of the seasons, their homes never fixed, their horses steady companions across the steppes. There were no maps that drew borders here. The people who lived here, tribes, we now call Rong, Di, or Zhongna, left behind few monuments, but we can imagine the rhythm of their days. The slow awakening of a morning camp, the stirring of embers in last night's fire, the clink of bronze tools being wrapped in leather, tied to belts, worn smooth from wear, the low murmur of voices planning the day's path, the rustle of tents being struck, and further south, in the growing towns of the Zhou and the Shang. Yet even these towns remained vulnerable, and in response, whispers began. But before the great ambition of the war could be conceived, there was only this land in motion. People with no clocks. Imagine the long twilight of an autumn evening, smoke trailing from a village hearth, a child being called in from the fields, a time of simple borders drawn. Now, as night deepens, we continue. The ground beneath us begins to shift. Small conflicts swell, walls not yet great, when the idea of a wall began to take shape in the minds of kings and soldiers alike. As the centuries passed, the quiet fluidity of the early borderlands began to change. Populations grew, ambitions stretched, and the need to defend not just territory, but order became clearer with each generation. The sky remains pale. The open fields are slowly giving way to more organized human spaces, scattered fortresses, to force them into valleys, or funnel them toward guarded passes. Eyes scanning the horizon with quiet determination. They shifted with borders, were breached by cunning, and sometimes abandoned entirely. For the warring states were restless. Lines were drawn and redrawn, fortresses built and then captured, cities founded, razed, and rebuilt under different banners. They stood not only against the threat of invasion, but also against the loneliness of distance. The idea that walls could serve not just to defend, efforts intensified to protect their northern boundaries from the mobile and elusive tribes beyond the Ordo's loop. Most notably, these were the ancestors of the Zhongnu. In small groups, they would ride, swift and quiet, looking for weaknesses, not always to invade, to remind the lowlands that walls were not answers, not as a sudden stroke of genius, but as the long accumulation of worry, observation, and ambition. They saw the rise of walls not as invitations to peace, but as signs of distrust, of separation. To them, walls were not signs of power, but barriers to be tested. They didn't yet call it a great wall. To them, it was simply the long wall. The Changchun Gandit's purpose was practical. Valleys threaded with long ridges of pressed earth, soldiers and sentries, markets with soldiers at their gates, children who grew up seeing barriers on the horizon, that a state could assert its presence, not with declarations. For many, the walls they guarded were the edge of their world. The sun setting over yet another length of earth raised high. Imagine, too, the silence afterward, and the quiet breath of a soldier watching for flickers of flame from the next tower down into the time of Qin. For farmers along the frontier, walls could mean more taxes, more labor, and more conscription. A stone in the field was no match for a hungry season. A wall rising across a path could mean a journey doubled, and for some, these new boundaries meant division of kin, of culture, of shared grazing lands turned into no man's zones. to give sentinels a view, to discourage watchful towers and lines of mud walls, tracing the edges of newly formed territories. These were the warring states, was one of the most extensive efforts of its time. And though the landscape has changed, of leaders trying to tame the wild not with understanding, but with borders, its path can still be traced in parts of today's Gansu and Shanxi. It was made of tamped earth, anchored in the yellow lowest soil, not visually striking now, but functional. And it marked something profound. Imagine yourself now in the 5th century BCE. It was a time of conflict, but not chaos. A time when states vied for supremacy, not with blind fury. Rammed earth embankments, packed tightly with layers of mud, gravel, and straw, were pressed down in rhythmic motions by countless feet and wooden tools. This process, called hung-tu, was simple but enduring. The walls weren't grand, they weren't built for show, but they stood quiet and strong. The Zhou dynasty still lingered in name, but its central power had long since faded, leaving behind a fractured map of small competing kingdoms, Qi and Han, each with its own customs, dialects, and designs, each one wary of the others. Between these states, these early walls weren't so much meant to keep invaders out forever. Alongside the walls, beacon towers were raised. They were slender, watchful things, often made of wood or stone, and spaced just far enough apart to be visible from one to the next. At night, in the day, plumes of smoke curled into the sky, each puff meaning something different. Enemy sighted, reinforcements needed, all clear. It is easy to imagine the men who stood atop these towers, wrapped in coarse robes, faces weathered by wind, and yet these walls were not permanent. Still, the idea persisted. In the state of Qin, under rulers like Duke Mu and later King Juxiang, these early walls told stories not in words, but in presence. Stories of anxiety, of growing kingdoms trying to become nations. Still, not all within the walls saw them as protection. Beyond the walls, the steppe people watched with caution, and test them they did. So, in this time before the unification, China's landscape became one of cautious geometry, hills with watchtowers. It is from this foundation, the slowly forming, that the idea of the Great Wall would later emerge. Imagine the slow thud of wooden rammers. In these early constructions, we see the first hints of something larger, something that would, in time, become more than just a wall, but a symbol. And so, we drift forward now, where the scattered stones of ancient lines begin to form a spina backbone for a fledgling empire. Let us walk now with the unifiers, the Qin unification, birth of the first wall. Now the landscape begins to change again. From the clustered, anxious kingdoms of the warring states, a single force begins to rise steady, deliberate, and with a hunger for unity. That force was Qin. The hills of the Central Plains are quieter than they've been in centuries. The clang of swords has faded. A war, not the patchwork of the past, not the individual defenses of kingdoms now dissolved, but one war, one boundary, for one empire. Banners no longer flutter with rival emblems. A new empire has emerged. Qin Shi Huang. Emperor hath declared, not just dominion, but permanence. And with this declaration comes a vision that stretches across the valleys and mountains and deserts, from the humid south to the dry wind-blown north. Imagine the year is 221 BCE, yet the line of the wall persisted, day by day, among his many reformed standardized weights. A single written script. New roads there was another, larger project. Many had been taken from their homes. A farmer from Chu, now swinging a pickaxe beneath a merciless sun. In the deep deserts and far mountains, the wall held a line, and so began one of the most enduring and misunderstood feats of ancient engineering, for boundaries that meant more than simple distance. In rumors, in the quiet awe of later dynasties who looked at those lines and saw both ambition, it was a declaration. The empire stops here, and the wall will bend with the needs of each new age. Beyond this line is the unknown, the uncivilized. Within is order, structure, the Qin way. A soldier leans against the packed earth, eyes following the ribbon of structure into the haze, with silence, with the patient push of hands against earth. There is no sound except the low whistle of wind slipping over the rampart. There is a stillness to it. In the long, still nights, small fires flickered along the encampments. Stories were shared. Fragments of songs floated on the wind. He died in 210 BCE, far from the capital, on a tour to inspect his empire. His tomb would become another massive project, buried beneath a hill, guarded by silent terracotta sentinels, from the labor of men to the shape of the land, and the dynasty he founded so vast. There were jokes, murmured prayers, old folk tales told again to make the dusk feel shorter, the unification of the early frontier walls into what would become the earliest Great Wall. But before imagining its greatness, let us start small. Their steps are slow, their eyes tired. Begin with a cart, a line of men behind it, some soldiers, others conscripted peasants, prisoners. As workers tamped it into form, the dust clung to their skin, settled into their clothes, and coated their lungs. Their breath was shallow, their pace measured by the sound of the overseer's drum or shouted rhythm. They worked in groups, some shifting soil, others lifting water jars to dampen the layers before pressing. All along the wall, this cadence echoed. Scoop, pour, press, move, again and again. Use what already exists. Connect the old walls of Qin, Zhao, and Yan. Extend them, link them together like arteries in a great body. The first emperor's orders were direct, stamped down again and again in careful layers. The tools were simple: baskets, wooden frames, iron shovels. The labor immense. These were not stone walls, not. They were made mostly of tamped earth and gravel. In the dry north, the soil was a pale yellow, soft and powdery. The terrain was often unkind. The workers came from all corners of the empire. They spoke different dialects. They carried different traditions. There were no monuments for these men, no songs sung in their honor. Yet they bore the burden of empire on their shoulders literally. Some perished, buried, not in graves. The Great Wall as tomb, but not all was struggle. Some found rhythm in the work, camaraderie in shared burdens, and above it all, the idea of the wall grew not just in length. It became more than a defense. Nomads still moved beyond its reach. Raids still occurred. Even Qin Shi Huang, himself stern and tireless, could not outlast time. But the war remained. It remained not just in structure. In maps drawn centuries later, what Qin began was not just a wall, but a precedent, a model for control and fear. Imagine now a stretch of wall at dusk. The air cools. The workers have stopped. This is the birth of the wall, but with labor. As we drift forward, the wall will change, stone will replace earth, emperors will rise and fall. But here, in the fading light of the Qin horizon, we feel the beginning. Let us now move quietly to see not what the wall was built of, but what it was built against. The ridgelines, the seasons, the sighing wind. We now step into the landscape itself. The wall as a landscape. There is a moment. It is in this in-between hour that the wall often looks most like a part of the land itself. Not a structure laid upon the earth, but something grown from it. Something ancient, weathered, and elemental. Imagine yourself waking beneath a canopy of muted stars. The chill of early air settles against your skin, and before you stretches a long curve of earth and stone. It winds softly along the ridge, cresting a distant hill, then disappearing into morning mist. Not loud. The builders, guided by engineers and military needs, still had to follow what the mountains told them. They did not cut through ranges. It was a network. At intervals. Their roofs low, their walls thick. Not grand, but functional. Dust hung in the air, catching the light in lazy spirals. It redirected animals. Small creatures burrowed into its base, making homes in its crevices. Over time, lichen clung to the shaded side, and dry grasses curled against the warm sun-soaked stones. In autumn, the wind grew sharper. Came hard and fast, sweeping in from Mongolia, draping the wall in snow and silence. Depending on light, stories of ghosts on the ramparts, of soldiers who never left their posts, of towers that lit themselves when danger approached. Not because people believed these tales, but because they gave shape to the silence. A presence that felt almost organic, less like a man-made structure, a steadiness, a reminder that for all the changes of dynasty and ruler, some things endure simply by being still. In many places, it appeared suddenly around a bend, beyond a tree line. A surprise, a hush, a participant in the landscape, not merely imposed upon it. We carry with us an image not of a path that knows no end. A moment of realization that something immense had been here long before you. Ice rimmed the stones. Children played beneath its towers, their voices echoing faintly between the stones. Merchants passed through its gates, where open stretches allowed brief contact between empires. Shepherds learned the sound of wind through its gapsa. different kind of music with each season. The echo of a footstep could travel down the line of towers like a whispered warning. But microclimate pockets. Moss crept along the lower bricks. The wall, in its stillness, water dripped from corners. Birds returned to perch on the battlements, calling to one another in voices as old as the stones beneath them. Square at their base, made of stone, brick, or packed clay, depending on what the land offered nearby. From their tops, one could see far in the dry air of the northern plains. They flowed, not imposing, just as constant as the ground beneath your feet. The Great Wall, even in its earliest forms, was never merely a wall. It was a boundary that flowed with the landscape. It hugged the cliffs. It followed rivers and skirted ravines. Where the terrain was sharp and high, where the land dipped into basins and valleys, the wall would sink with it low and barely visible, then rise again like a slow breath exhaled by the earth. This was not an accident. It was a kind of architectural listening and attention paid to the land's language. In this way, the wall became a kind of horizon line, a quiet geometry stretching across thousands of kilometers. But it was more than a line. The watchman, up there often, just 2 or 3 to a tower knew. The feel of wind patterns, the changes in cloud cover, the distance at which a rider could be spotted. Their eyes were trained to catch flickers of movement, dust rising from a gallop. And between these towers, the seasons turned differently here. Summers were hot, dry, and golden. To live with the wall was to live with weather. The structure shaped airflow. And yet, despite its size, the wall did not always dominate the senses. Travelers who approached it from afar often remarked on how it seemed to disappear and reappear. In time, entire ecosystems formed around the wall, adapted to. Farmers planted their fields in patterns shaped by the wall's shadow, sometimes in the deep hours of the night. There is a kind of comfort in that silence. The wall was never invincible. It was breached, bypassed. And so, as we leave this first chapter behind, the wall, at its quietest, is not a thing of might. It is a thing of memory, a witness. And now, as the rhythm of our journey continues, to the hands behind the stones, to the people whose lives were spent in the shadow of duty, command, and labor, let us now walk among the builders, not the kings, but the calloused, sun-browned workers who bore the burden of the wall's rising weight, who built the wall. The forgotten hands. The wall stands silent, but beneath every stone, not of generals, but of hands, hands that blistered, hands of men whose names were never carved into monuments, and whose lives faded quietly into dust, hands that dug, carried, pressed, and placed, raw, earthen. The day is beginning for the builders. Tonight, we walk with them. Others are convicts, sent here not for what they built, but as payment for what they did. A few are simply those who couldn't pay their taxes. For them, a wall is now their life. Step by weary step. Imagine yourself standing in the cool morning of a high plateau. The mist is still lifting. Many are peasants. Some are soldiers punished or reassigned to labor duty. It was not always cruel in intent, but it was unyielding in execution. If your number came up, you went. You left your home, your family. You walked for days, a wall to build, a wall to sleep beside, a wall to die under. Some were merely dull, quiet ones. A laugh was rare, but not unheard. When tools splintered and carts broke and tempers flared, when a man collapsed, he would be buried nearby in shallow soil, under a marker made of loose stones. If laughter was a small rebellion against the labor, against the weight of it all, repetitive, the same motion again and again. Men grew used to it, some for years, some never returned home. The creak of wood, the rustle of footsteps in dry grass, the soft cough of dust rising from the soil. Their hands hardened, whispers that the dead were simply added into the wall, that no one would miss them. The imperial system of labor, and once there, the work began. The scent of smoke and cooking grain. Each man was assigned to a crew. The crews were structured. A single overseer might manage dozens. Timber dragged from sparse groves. Desertion was dangerous, and often futile, but still, some tried. Slipping away in the night, others chose a quieter form of resistance, working slower, resting longer, speaking just out of reach of the overseer's ear. The tools were few shovels, picks, poles for ramming, wooden molds to shape the layers. Everything was reused and rarely replaced. Think of the rhythm of their work, of the songs they sang under their breath, of the footprints they left in drying clay, to the nature of that work. Food was basic, crisp gruel, if lucky, water drawn from a shared well or stream. The crews walking back to their tents or lean-tos, shoulders slumped, a silence heavier than fatigue. Meals were eaten in silence or with quiet murmurs, squatting in the shadow of a cart. No room for questions, no room for delay. The mornings were early, then came the lifting. Baskets of earth passed from man to man. Stones pulled by ropes over makeshift ramps. A day's rhythm was marked, a break at mid-adjust. They made jokes, sometimes. But there were darker days, days when the sun blazed, and sometimes there were whispers. We do not know if this is truth or tale. The records are quiet, but the whispers remain. For every kilometer of war, and for every tower, dozens more. Men rotated in and out, some for weeks. Yet, even within this hardship, a shared bowl of soup passed between men too tired to speak. A poem scratched into the side of a cart. A lullaby, sung by a soldier for the child he left behind. The wall was their world, and though they built it under command, they also gave it a kind of humanity. Some tried to escape. Their lives were not measured in success or failure. They were measured in endurance. Imagine the end of a long day. The sun lowering behind the hills, then the hiss of firewood catching flame. They had no medals, no rewards, but they had each other, and they had built something stone by stone, but because it was demanded. As you rest now in the softness of night, but their work endured to the materials they used, and the way those materials shaped the wall itself, the drag of stone, the quiet architecture of labor. The wall is massive. It coils like a sleeping giant across mountains and valleys, deserts and forests, from the humid east to the arid west. Its shape shifts stone in one place to endure. And yet, for all its immensity, things taken from the land itself, stone, soil, straw, tonight we walk slowly through that process. Not the history of battles, but the quiet choreography of construction. Begin with the earliest walls, those of the chin. Earth mixed with gravel, straw, reeds, and anything that might give it strength. Then came the tamping, with feet, backs, and arms that did not rest. The compressed earth became as hard as rock over time, golden brown structure that could last for centuries, especially in the dry north, where rain was scarce and time moved slowly. These were not made of stone, as many imagine today, but of earth, rammed earth, or a technique both ancient and enduring, made in kilns scattered across the empire. These bricks were baked with care, stamped with the names of officials or provinces to ensure accountability. A subtle bureaucracy hidden in each block. The method was simple, though never easy. First, 2 parallel wooden frames were erected, planks, supported by stakes, about the width of a small cart road, kneading it with straw, firing it in hot, smoky kilns for days, then loading the bricks into carts, hoisting them onto donkeys or backs. Wooden rammers heavy, a rhythmic sound. It softened the earth, mixed the mortar. Some forests vanished near the wall zones, cut slowly, purposefully, to supply an effort that never quite ended. Builders reused every scrap. Even broken beams were reshaped into handles, wedges, or firewood. Cooled the tools. In some arid places, water had to be carried long distances, stored in clay jars. A steady thump, like the heartbeat of the wall itself. This was done with the force of bodies. The empire required progress. Inspectors came. Quotas were tracked. A section half built meant no rations, no rest. And so the work continued. But not all terrain suited this method. In areas where stone was plentiful along mountain ridges or near riverbeds, builders turned to what lay at their feet. Stones were stacked in rows, shaped when needed, and held together with a rough, early mortar of clay or lime. Larger blocks formed the base. It was not ornamental, not decorative, but it was strong. They clung to the shoulders of workers during the Ming Dynasty. The material palette shifted again, piecemeal, uniform, not in carvings or initials, but in form, in texture, the slightly uneven angle of a step, the tilt of a parapet shaped by exhaustion or urgency. Imagine the process. Men scooping clay from riverbanks. Water was crucial to walk its stones today, used for scaffolding. Trees were felled with care. And then there were the tools, so modest in design. Iron shovels, letting the day's dust settle on their skin like another layer of mortar. Sometimes they sang not loudly, but softly, ropes braided from hemp or silk, strong enough to haul stone, but soft enough not to snap under stress. Baskets, thousands of them woven from reeds, used to carry earth, or lime, or food. The rhythm of building was rarely fast. It was slow, methodical, and often tedious. 100 steps just to lay a meter. Dozens of men to raise a single tower. Bricks moved one at a time. And in the hot months, when hands blistered and tempers frayed, the pace slowed further, but the wall could not pause. Evenings brought brief respite. Workers leaned against half-finished segments, a kind of music, a kind of resistance. Over years, the segments grew. Lines of wall stretched toward one another like fingers seeking to clasp. Paths widened into patrol roads. The wall was not built all at once, and in each stone the scrape of shovel on earth, the murmur of commands in dozens of dialects, the flap of canvas tents in dry wind, the quiet drumbeat of an empire stretching its fingers across the wild. It is easy to admire the wall from afar, but up close it is rough. It is humble. It is made not of greatness, stone after stone, layer after layer, turned into something timeless. Now, let us follow this structure into a quieter place, a darker one, where the cost of these efforts, to the illness, hidden costs, a presence as old as memory, stretching beyond the line of sight, but beneath its endurance lies a quiet ledger written, not of stone, but of life. To build such an immense structure was never only a feat of engineering, of endurance, of survival, and many did not survive. As we walk now through this portion of the story, but to acknowledge the fullness of what the wall truly was, imagine a labor camp in the cold season. The wind slipping into tents, lifting dust across the frozen ground. The fire burns low, wood is scarce. Men huddle in layers of wool and straw, their breath visible in the dark. This was life for tens of thousands during the great building efforts. Limited food, long hours of exposure, conditions born not of battlefield wounds, but of poor water, spoiled grain, or exposure. The kind of slow illnesses that leave few marks on history, but hollowed thousands of men. No physicians beyond the most basic healers. And so, when fever came, when bellies turned with cramps, when breath grew shallow and ragged, there was only The empire spoke instead in quotas and tallies, how many bricks, how many meters completed, how many days ahead or behind schedule. Others collapsed during the day's work and never stood again, or silence. Illness found them present, months passed, then years, no letters. Finally, she set out herself, walking 1,000 li to find him. Her tears fell on the stone, silhouettes that drift along the battlements in the fog, offered coin in place of labor. There were no hospitals. Many died slowly, quietly, some curled in the corners of shelters, trying not to disturb their companions. The most common afflictions were simple dysentery infections, pneumonia, their bones unearthed by time, erosion, or chance. And yet, the wall grew. It grew through these losses. Each segment continued, even as those who built it disappeared from the rolls. The records we have from the early dynasties do not often speak of these deaths. Whispers of men who never returned. You look out, and the land unfolds in waves of grass and stone, of mothers waiting at village gates, until their hair turned white. Brick kilns burned night and day. Soldiers patrolled the wall during and after its construction, suffering the same conditions as those who'd raised the stones beneath their feet. Of wives who lit lanterns every seventh night, calling home the souls of husbands sent away. In northern folklore, some believe that ghosts gather along the waldron by duty or longing, or simply by the walls themselves, not angry spirits. You may have heard one such story, the tale of Mungjangnu. It is said that her husband was taken soon after their marriage, sent to build the wall. When she reached the wall, the foreman told her the truth. Her husband had died. He had been buried within the wall itself. She wept. Of course, it is legend of those who tried to flee, to resist, to say no in a world that demanded only yes. Even emperors knew the toll. Later dynasties tried to lessen the burden, and so the toll continued, generation after generation. In the Ming era, when bricks replaced earth, the work did not grow easier, it only shifted. There are no massed graves marked along the wall, no great cemeteries or shrines for the builders, but their remains lie scattered in the soil. A rusted buckle there, a pottery shard with the faintest inscription, and still the wall holds, not proud, not boastful, but enduring, a quiet witness to the lives it consumed. Imagine standing atop a remote tower now. The wind is gentle, but constant. You feel a kind of peace, but it is a peace layered with memory. But it is also heavy. Its silence is not emptiness but remembrance. For every stone laid, someone gave a day of their life. For every tower, a winter was endured. For every ridge, climbed a dozen breaths, was spent in toil. They are gone now, but the rhythm of their labor lingers. Now, as we continue our slow journey, we look not to the ones who obeyed, but not all stayed silent. Let us now walk among the whispers of dissent, whispered rebellions, resistance, and discontent for every order shouted. There is a whisper for every command obeyed, a question quietly buried beneath it. And even in the shadow of something as immense and permanent as the wall, some refuse to be silent. This part of our journey moves even more softly into the hushed folds of dissent, the quiet rebellions, small disobedience, and slow cracks that ran beneath the surface of the wall's creation. Not all resistance is loud, but up close, you notice a lag, a pause, a slightly longer break in the shade, a gesture of dignity in a place designed to strip it away, a basket left a little longer on the ground, eyes that flick upward. Imagine the rows of laborers bent, dust rises from a distance. They move in rhythm. This is one kind of rebellion hidden in plain sight. For many who were conscripted, a stolen rest. In the Qin dynasty, the first to attempt a unified wall, punishments for disobedience were severe. Public beatings, corruption seeped into the system. Officials siphoned off grain meant for workers, Bricks were sold on black markets. Labor rosters were forged. Some men paid others to take their place. Others bribed clerks to erase their names from the rolls, who left no names but bore the weight of compassion, brandings, chains, execution, boredom, loneliness. They were fatigued, the kind of fatigue that settles into bones, that tells a man to live not for country or emperor, but simply for tomorrow. Pay that came late or not at all, and yet desertions occurred of captains negotiating with raiders, records from later dynasties. A man sits near the fire, looking out over the wall he helped to build. His hands are cracked. His legs ache. It aged. It was breached not just by armies, but by those it relied on to stand. Small groups who spoke in hushed tones as the fires died at night. Complaints passed between sips of millet wine. Grievances murmured into the dust. But the wall was never the enemy. It was led by two men. But as a being, when the delay threatened to cost them their lives under Qin law, they chose to revolt instead. Rarely did these turn into revolts, but the feeling lingered, a low, persistent hum of discontent beneath the surface of obedience, or who were caught trying to return to their villages under cover of darkness. Some succeeded. A few were helped by sympathetic villagers given food, clothing, directions. These were the quiet helpers of history, and when they were, their punishment became a warning. Sometimes their bodies were displayed beside the wall. Other times they simply disappeared. Then there were the mutterings. In the Ming Dynasty, the wall's later and more famous rebuilding effort was managed by a vast network of bureaucrats, engineers, and regional lords. Resistance took the form of manipulation. Even soldiers, assigned to patrol and defend the wall, grew restless. Long tours of duty, cold winters in remote towers, and when danger did come, there are recorded instances of garrisons abandoning their posts. These acts were not always cowardice. In the final days of the Qin, their rebellion failed, but soon Qin fell, and the wall. In later centuries, peasant revolts swept through the empire. It is easy to imagine that these rebellions were large, fiery things, but more often they were small. A man refusing to lift his shovel, a soldier sharing food with an outcast, a cart pushed deliberately slower than ordered. These were not victories. Moments when a person remembered himself not as a cog. And perhaps this is why the wall, as permanent as it seems, never fully held. Imagine now a cold night. He does not speak, but in his stillness, there is resistance. The wall is not just a monument to unity. It is also a record of opposition, in footprints that led away instead of forward. And now, as the fires die and the night settles deeper, we bring this segment to a close. From the early states to the imperial command, from the builders to the bricks, from sacrifice to silence, and finally to resistance, the wall is all of this. And in our next chapter, we move from construction to occupation, to those who lived beside it, who guarded it. Let us step into life along the wall, a life of patrols, cold towers. Life along the wall was built to hold the line, but a wall, no matter how strong, does not stand alone. It must be watched, patrolled, manned, and so, along its length, generation after generation, this part of our journey slows even further. It enters the quiet rhythm of garrison. Imagine a remote outpost, far from the cities of the south. It is morning. The sun, still low, a watchtower, not with urgency, but with routine. The men who lived and worked along the wall were not always elite troops. Many were ordinary conscripts, rotated through northern outposts to serve their time. Some were veterans of old campaigns, older now, their armor dented, their swords dulled from disuse. Others were young, barely past boyhood, their armor too large, their faces still unsure. Life in a war garrison was marked not by glory but by monotony. Before dawn, 1 or 2 soldiers would climb to the top of the tower. From there, they would scan the horizon, not with suspicion, but with the sleepy vigilance of habit. Most days, there was nothing to see, only the slow movement of clouds, the ripple of grass, perhaps a shepherd in the distance. Below, a small cook fire was lit. Boots thudded on the stone. Some played quiet games with stones or sticks, dice and tiles. Simple rules, simple distractions. Horns might sound. A report would be written, sealed, and sent down the wall by courier, not out of panic but procedure. Swords were cleaned, bows restrung, yet most knew these tools would gather more dust than blood. Each patrol could take hours. The scent of millet porridge filled the cramped barrack room. They noted cracks in the wall, signs of erosion. The captain, pipes were smoked in silence. A soldier might wrap his feet in old cloth to hold in the warmth, hid them in their belongings, spoke them aloud to the cold stones. Others in stories passed down by older comrades, tales of legendary raids, of bandits outsmarted. He might share his blanket, not out of friendship, but necessity. But these events were rare and met with grumbling. The wall was no barracks parade ground, it was a place of endurance. Occasionally, bits of preserved vegetables or salted meat were stirred in. Bread was rare, rice rarer. In the north, supplies were erratic. The garrison lived simply grains. Patrols were scheduled in shifts. 2 men would walk a stretch of wall from one tower to the next, not to fight but to observe. Their pace was slow. They passed signal towers, some still manned, others deserted. They checked beacon platforms, where wood and hay were stacked for emergency fires. A kettle already warming inside the tower. It was not the thrill of defense, it was maintenance, endless, uneventful vigilance. Inside the towers, some wrote letters. Weapons were maintained not out of expectation. Still, there were moments. Occasionally, a rider was spotted, a trader, perhaps, or a scout from beyond the border. Then the tower would stir, and in winter, snow blanketed the wall. Fires barely warmed the rooms. Rations were stretched. Illness was constant. Coughs that never quite healed, fingers that never warmed. Letters home, when they arrived, were treasured, and when they didn't, men wrote them anyway, folded them. Some found solace in book small collections of poetry carried from the south. For the wall was full of ghosts, they said. spirits of fallen soldiers, builders who never left. It was said that on quiet nights you could hear footsteps on the parapet, that sometimes the beacon towers lit themselves, not from fire, but memory. But most nights were too still for even legends. The stars above the northern plains were sharp and endless. The moon laid silver across the stone. A lone soldier stood watch, wrapped in wool, staring into the dark, hearing only his own breath. This was garrison life. No drama, no charge of cavalry, just dust, wind, and time. And yet, in this stillness, a different kind of strength was forged. To endure, to be the line. Imagine, now, a patrol returning just after sunset. Their footsteps soft on the rampart. No alarm, no news. Just another day. This was the war's most frequent state, not war, but watchfulness and tomorrow. As we move forward, of families, merchants, and wind-blown homes along the wall, in the next part, we step beyond the garrisons and into the villages. We go now to firelight and trade, to the smells of cooking grain and the laughter of children in distant settlements. Settlements near the wall. The Great Wall was never truly alone. Villages rose in its shadow. Fires burned in hearths. Families settled, not only to guard the empire but to live beside it. Tonight, we walk through these forgotten settlements, not the military posts, the soft edges of survival. Smoke rises gently from chimney holes, the small communities that made their peace with the wall's long shadow, built low to the ground, their walls thick to retain heat. Some lay directly beneath the wall, others were scattered farther down the slope. Imagine now a winter morning in a small frontier village. The wind presses against clay-tiled roofs. Frost glistens on the narrow lanes. These settlements were humble clusters of mud-brick homes. Their people were a mix of types. They led oxen into the frost-hardened fields, dragging wooden plows through the loamy soil. Crops were hardy: millet, barley, beans. Meals were simple: porridge, boiled greens, a sliver of preserved meat. Occasionally, a trader would bring fruit from the south-dried apricots. Small luxuries that were savoured slowly. In autumn, Plaza Square or Dusty, these were not stories of emperors or battles. They were stories of fox spirits in the hills, of a neighbour's runaway goat, of strange footprints seen in the snow. Some were the families of soldiers' wives, children, aging parents who had followed duty into the north. Others were merchants, drawn by the promise of trade at the edge of empire. Still others were farmers in the warmer seasons. Women fetched water from narrow wells. Children carried bundles of wood from the hills. They came warily, often under watch. At the heart of many villages was a small gathering every 7 or 10 days. Wind markets, they were sometimes called temporary collections of vendors, spread across canvas tents and straw mats, where voices rose and coins changed hands. Their spices met silk. Rough woolen cloaks were traded for stoneware bowls. Old knives were sharpened, while news from the capital was passed between hands. A string of garlic, a scroll of poetry, a jar of pickled radish. These markets were more than trade. That the world beyond the wall still moved. Children paraded through the streets with red paper dragons. Sweet cakes were made, their scent mixing with ash and joy. Sometimes travelers from even farther north appeared, nomads with horses and rawhide boots. They brought furs, smoked meats, rough liquor, and bowls of food left out for spirits who might linger. The wall, many believed, too full of wandering souls, of disease brought by passing caravans, and in the evenings, grain ground into flour, letters sent south on the backs of slow mules, old songs sung in cracked voices, accompanied by bamboo flutes and wooden clappers, songs of home, songs of ancestors, songs with no clear beginning or end. The sky dimmed, a place where boys dared each other to climb after chores were done. Lanterns glowed behind oiled paper windows. Inside, families sat close to their fires, wrapped in quilts, patched and repatched over decades. Stories drifted across the room like steam. A grandmother recalled her youth in the south. A father reminded his son how to mend a fence post. A mother taught her daughter how to weave wool, slow and rhythmic. The pattern passed down from her own mother. Outside, the wall stood, silent, cold, watching a single home, a grandmother humming. But inside the homes, there were festivals, too, even in this edge-of-the-world place. On the 15th night of the first moon, in the autumn, and even funerals so somber were. Occasions of care. The dead were not buried near the wall. A stone was placed, incense burned. There were fears, of course, of raiders from the north, of imperial tax collectors. Fences were repaired, and in time, those who lived near the wall stopped seeing it as a boundary. It became simply there, a backdrop to life, a wall against which garlic was hung to dry. In spring, wildflowers bloomed near its base. In autumn, leaves piled in its crevices. In all seasons, it stood. Imagine now the quiet of a winter night. Outside, the wall breathes with the cold. Inside, as we drift onward, in the next part, we enter a world of legends, of soldiers, tailies, whispered warnings, and the glow of lanterns in the dark. The wall is more than a structure. It is a story. And stories are what kept people company. In the silence, the wall stands as stone, beyond the watchtowers, and beyond the barracks. Across villages nestled in its shadow and sentries pacing in rhythm with the sun, the wall gave rise to a world of voices soft murmuring, enduring voices that filled the silences with meaning, that turned fear into fable. This part of our walk is slower still, wrapped in mist and memory. Whether during the Han attempts or the Ming were literate not scholars, but taught just enough to read and write. They wrote home on paper or silk, their brush strokes, careful ink. Let us sit now by the fire of an old garrison hut, or beneath the lantern light of a winter market stall. Begin with the simplest stories. Many of the men stationed along the wall. The weather is cold, the rations are thin, and yet they remain. The wall holds them like a diary with no reader, a song hummed too softly to hear, I miss the sound of chickens in the courtyard, etched into wooden boards or the backs of broken tools. Please send word if the harvest was good. One night, he heard it whispered by the wind. He vanished, returning home as a crow that circled his mother's rooftop for 3 days. Before flying north again, I am well. Not the great deities of the south. When people climbed to investigate, no oil, no wick. They sat, folded in cloth bundles, stashed beneath sleeping mats. Most were seen as watchful, even helpful. A shadow near the barracks door that warned of a storm. A figure seen pacing the wall. It was said that every tower had at least one spirit, and if treated respectfully with offerings of smoke or whispered greetings, they kept the soldiers safe. Left unfinished when duties pulled the writer away, they were spoken softly. Some say the lanterns guided the souls of the dead to rest. Others say they carried messages to those far away, often while warming numb hands around a bowl of soup or cup of weak wine. Some were intercepted, but those that did reach home were read slowly. A voice returned, if only briefly. Some were never sent. Then there were the notes that never left the wall. Not because they were blocked, but scratched into brick, hidden beneath loose stone. A date, a brief lament. 3 years here. My son was born in the spring. No one was meant to read these. From these real, small echoes, we move gently into something less solid, but the legends, every bend, every crevice, many were told simply to pass the time. Listening to a friend, the Great Wall over the centuries collected stories like moss. You already know one. The story of Meng Jiangnu, whose tears brought down a tower. But there are others. One tale tells of a soldier who was stationed alone in a distant post. So long and so far, he forgot his own name. Another tells of a lantern. They were not feared in the usual way. In many of the small temples near the wall, the spirit of the north wind called upon to spare the watchman's fires. The old man of the tower, the lady of lantern smoke, who walked the wall in white and brought sleep to those too restless to dream. They served a purpose. They made the silence feel less empty, and they were passed on. A new recruit would arrive and be told, or, if the crows cry twice at midnight, but in a place defined by waiting and distance. Belief became its own form of warmth. Even festivals carried the weight of story. During the Mid-Autumn Festival, when the moon was brightest, soldiers and civilians alike would light paper lanterns and place them on the wall. One soldier wrote a poem on his lantern. Let it pass over the wall and through the gate. Let my mother see it and smile. The lantern was never found again. Stories and smoke. Together, they built the soul. It is said that when an army of ghosts marched south to the capital during a bitter winter, they stopped at the wall. They had built it. They had bled into it. And they would not cross it again. But we do know this. The wall was not just a place of labor. It was a place of memory. And memory. Imagine now the soft glow of a lantern at dusk. It flickers once, twice, then steadies. A soldier leans against the stone, because sometimes the story is not for belief, it's for comfort. As we move now toward the outer world beyond the wall, we leave behind the fires and folklore, and turned to those who lived on the other side, the steppe, the plains, the riders, the herders. Let us now walk beyond the barrier and into the rhythm of life, as seen from the far side of the stones. The wall was not the end of the world. Beyond its towers there was breath of people who did not build walls but rode beside them, circled around them, and watched their growth with quiet eyes. This final part of our segment takes us not into conflict. The grasses are short and brittle underfoot. It is a mobile one, washed in silver by frost. Not a single people, but many, each with their own customs, languages, and ways of reading the land. Their hooves stir up mist from the sleeping earth. A figure on horseback guides them, a man or a woman wrapped in furs, a bow slung across their back, their breath visible in the cold air. We walk now with those who lived on the other side, not as enemies, but as neighbors, not as invaders. Imagine the northern steppe at dawn. This is not a static life. Milk flowed, fires were kept low, meals were shared, stories were told, not unlike those within the wall of spirits, ancestors, winds that changed fortunes. Songs were sung around fire pits, low and melodic, without instruments, carried by voice alone. The people of the steppe lived not in villages, placed where the grass was thick, the water clear, and the sky wide. They were the Zhongnu, the Wuwan, the Ruren, the Heaton, where the great wall rose from stone and labor. Their homes rose from felt and rope. The yacht, carried by ox or camel. Traders, nor you. Traders arrived from the south, sometimes under treaty, sometimes on hidden trails. Cloth, tea, salt, iron tools, small, fast-moving groups would test the defenses. But even these were not always acts of conquest. They were often signs of desperation. In exchange, the nomads offered furs, hides, fermented mares, milk, and knowledge of the land's unseen parts. To those beyond the wall, the earth was not something to divide. Their rhythm was set by the seasons. In spring, herds moved northward, and some soldiers of the wall chose not to return south but to live among the herders, finding in the endless sky something the bricks could never offer. In summer, autumn was harvested of grain, and in winter they endured. Children learned to ride before they could write. Elders told time not by clock, but by stars, by the bend of grass, the taste of snow. Their relationship with the wall was not always peaceful, but neither was it always hostile. They speak through signs, gestures. They smile, exchange bundles, a famine, then turn and disappear into their separate horizons. To some, it was a curiosity, a ribbon of stone. To others, a source of goods, a place where trade could be managed or smuggling arranged. And to others still, it was a challenger line to cross, when politics soured or drought made pasture scarce. Raids did occur, for the wall to the steppe peoples was not simply a barrier, it was a mirror. Where the empire prized control and boundaries, the nomads prized adaptation and movement. Where the wall imposed order, the steppe allowed freedom. Where one built permanence in stone, a woman braids her daughter's hair by firelight. He looks to the south, in the distance, yet the two worlds were not so far apart. We step away from both sides, from the garrison and the garand. Prepare to enter a new chapter. Marriage treaties were made. Children of steppe rulers were raised in southern courts. Border lords learnt the languages of the riders. Even spiritual views reflected this contrast. The people within the wall worshipped ancestors through incense and ceremony. The people beyond offered milk to the earth. And yet, both stood in silence. When the stars were clear, both listened for the howl of wolves at night. Imagine now a scene not often told. Two traders, one from a wallside village, just goods and quiet words. When the empire that built it began to dream in stone once more, quiet coexistence. Breath exchanged across the boundary. And when tension did rise, when empires clashed and dynasties shifted, it was not always the wall that held the balance. Over time, stories flowed back and forth. Nomads told tales of cities. Villagers whispered stories of horsemen who rode the wind and knew the names of stars. Sometimes these stories clashed. Sometimes they met. And in the quiet between, a kind of shared memory, the wall from the steppe side looked different. A destination. A place to see the empire without stepping inside. And so it stood. Imagine now the end of a day on the steppe. A yacht glows from within. He does not fear it. He does not worship it. He simply sees it. Another presence in a shared world. And so, as we bring this segment to a close, of what the wall became, we now travel to the Ming Dynasty, where the wall was reshaped not only by labor but Wall as Empire's Veil, Part 1. Rebuilding and Reinventing. Ming engineering. By the time of the Ming Dynasty, the Great Wall was already ancient. Its earliest lengths rammed earth, soft stone, memory-worn paths had stood for centuries, patched and repurposed, abandoned and But in the 14th and 15th centuries, something changed. It became a declaration. This was the age of rebuilding, of transforming a fading line into a monumental spine for an empire newly wary of the world beyond its gates. Let us walk, now, slowly, into this age of reinvention. The Ming came to power after the collapse of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty. The scars of foreign rule ran deep. Though the Mongols had gone, the steppes were still home to mounted confederations, swift and elusive, capable of raiding with little warning, testing borders, and reminding the empire of its vulnerability. And so, under emperors like Hongwu, Yonggol, and later Jing, a vast project was revived. The wall would rise again, but different, stronger, stoned, not earth. Engineers calculated angles and placements. Supply routes were charted. All around, men move in slow harmony, hauling bricks, lifting beams, mixing mortar in large wooden vats, measured, documented, and built, not just to protect, but to endure. Imagine yourself now standing in a deep valley in northern China, sometime in the 15th century. The air smells faintly of lime and ash. Smaller ones, stacked into parapets. Unlike earlier mud-based mortar, it resisted weather. It endured. This was not spontaneous labor. It was planned. Men molded clay into shape. Each brick bore markings codes to indicate its origin, its supervisor, its batch. If a wall collapsed later, wide enough in many places for 5 soldiers to march abreast, staggered with openings at regular intervals, arrow slits that allowed archers to fire without full exposure. The Ming organized surveyors mapped the land, equipped with smoke pots and flags for day, fire for night. A single beacon, once lit, could carry a message across hundreds of kilometers in just a few hours. This was no longer a wall of desperation, it was a wall of bureaucracy, often where the terrain widened or where multiple wall paths converged. Unlike in earlier eras, the labor was more regulated, but still punishing. The terrain remained cruel. Mountains had to be climbed, rivers bridged. The bricks are smooth beneath your feet. The parapets rise waist high, every few meters marked by a square turret. In the distance, the wall ripples over hills, folding and unfolding like silk over fingers, stone quarried and hauled by hand. These bases housed troops, horses, supplies, and served as regional command posts. The materials themselves had changed, but the momentum, once begun, emperors came and went. Dynasties changed tone. In the east, where clay was plentiful, bricks were used, uniform, fired, and sturdy. Kilns dotted the countryside. In the west, massive blocks formed the foundations. Between the bricks and the structure itself evolved. The wall was no longer a simple ridge. From the Bahai Sea in the east to the deserts of Gansu, the wall stretched like a calligraphy stroke across the map, firm and deliberate. A complex network of layers. He is not unlike his predecessors wrapped in wool, but the structure beneath his feet is stronger. He walks not on earth. First, the main wall high, thick, with crenellated battlements for archers to shield behind. Then the parapets, watchtowers, built every few hundred meters, now rose taller, with multiple levels. Their windows faced in all directions, allowing for full surveillance. Some towers included, beyond this, the Ming added fortresses, major military bases spaced strategically alongside the wall. The patrol roads ran like veins, well-maintained paths that allowed riders to move quickly between sections, and scattered throughout were signal stations. But what truly defined the Ming Wall was its scope. Never before had such a coordinated effort. Over 5,000 kilometers of wall were rebuilt or newly constructed. This effort spanned reigns. Thousands of workers were conscripted, soldiers, peasants, prisoners, yet the result was immense. Imagine standing now atop a Ming era wall. The view is endless. And so was the labor. Even with Ming organization, the wall was slow to build. Some sections took decades. Others were never truly finished. The wall became not only a military tool but a symbol. It said, "Here is the line." Within it, the order of empire. Of course, the wall was not impenetrable. Raids still occurred. Treaties were still broken. But the wall changed the rhythm of those interactions. It slowed advances, it forced negotiation, and it gave the Ming something priceless: time. Time to remember the lesson of the past. Imagine now a soldier walking the wall in the era of Emperor Wanlei. He knows the history. He knows this wall was once earth alone. He knows others stood here long before. And he knows that somewhere down the line, someone will stand here again. As we close this part of our journey, ahead lies the quieter system beneath the wall, the paperwork, the permits, the people who counted bricks more than soldiers. Let us now descend from the parapets and walk the corridors of command. When we think of the Great Wall, but beneath the wall and behind it, another structure existed, one not built of bricks and mortar, but of scrolls, stamps, ledgers, and seals. This was the wall's paper spine, invisible to the eye, but essential to its endurance. Every grain rationed to a patrol station was recorded. The Empire did not just build the wall, it documented it into existence. The scribes who never touched a brick, the Ming dynasty, in its meticulousness, wrapped the Great Wall in systems. Every brick moved, every man deployed. The world of the imperial clerks, the quartermasters, a room tucked inside a fortress near the wall, are orders from the capital official edicts, from the Ministry of Works, the Ministry of War, and the Senate. Together, they oversee the entire wall, not just as a physical line, but as a living system. Daily entries, supplies delivered or delayed, soldiers signed off on their watch hours, grain inventories were tallied in tables. Even the lighting of signal fires had to be recorded. Time, reason, response. The wall was not only defended by stone, it was monitored by bureaucracy. Its shelves are lined with bamboo scrolls and folded paper files, bound with silk thread. The air is dry, scented faintly with wax and old wood. Outside, the only sound, verified, stamped 3 times, and countersigned by the regional commander. A clerk sits, brush in hand. He is recording the delivery of 27 carts of brick, stamped and sealed, from a kill 100 li away. Their task: to uncover embezzlement, neglect, not only to ensure quality, but to establish responsibility. A single brick might bear the name of the kill. They carried notebooks and inkstones instead of swords. The artisan supervisor, the local inspector, and even the date of manufacture. If the wall crumbled, each cart is described, its contents, its condition, its origin, known as Jai and Zunzon. Each had its own leadership: military commanders for defense, civil officers for supply and construction, and surveillance officials to report corruption. Each page must be perfect. Mistakes are corrected, not by erasure. Above him, hanging on the wall, petitions from commanders, Section Jiaojia 1. Tower 17 noted slight erosion on eastern foundation. Reinforcement ordered. A marriage license, approved by the local commander. Their pens etched out the lines that kept the wall standing. A census entry, 600 bricks, requisitioned. Completion expected within 10 days. Weather permitting, the emperor himself, though distant from the stones, was fed a slow, steady stream of knowledge from the frontier. The wall was divided into sections. Bricks used in Ming construction were marked at every station. Logs were kept. There were permits for everything. To cross a gate, a merchant needed a document sealed with red wax, noting his purpose, his goods, his origin, and his return path. To transport supplies along the wall, and behind this lattice of ledgers and locks, censors roving, Some were feared for all its rigidity. The seal still drying when the tower was emptied, it prevented fraud in construction. It maintained the wall as not only a monument, but it also bred a certain kind of inertia. An unsigned order might stall a repair for weeks. A missing seal could strand a supply convoy until clarification arrived from the provincial seat. And yet, despite these frictions, the system endured. In the grand archives of the Ming court, shelves of dispatches from outposts. Imagine now an imperial official reading one such report. 3rd month, 16th day. It is dry, but in it lies the life of the wall. A foundation shift is not just a crack, it is a sign. A failure of supply is not merely inconvenience. The wall lived by schedule, and every schedule lived by ink. Bureaucracy also governed the human side of the wall. Garrison rosters were maintained with obsessive care. A soldier's age, origin, service, duration, equipment, issued pay rate, all were recorded. If a man died, a death register was filed, and his replacement dispatched often weeks later. Soldiers settled, married, raised children, but even this was documented. A request to build a home. In time, entire communities grew up around the wall, not only soldiers, but scribes, clerks, tax collectors, inspectors, grain keepers. We do not remember their names. We see no statues to the man who corrected the grain roster, but the wall's strength came from this quiet ink, as much as from stone. And when the Ming began to fray, when silver grew scarce, and borders strained, nor you, and borders strained, these records told the tale before the bricks could crumble. Reports of missing supplies, of troop shortages, of beacon towers unmanned. Bureaucracy, for all its strengths, cannot fight decay. It can only delay it. And so, the wall's final chapters in the Ming period were written as much in waning ledgers as they were in mortar. Imagine now an abandoned tower, a register still open on a desk. The ink faded, paper does not echo, but it remembers. Now we step away from ledgers and into something older still, the rituals that shaped how people saw the wall, not as bricks or policies, but as part of the sacred rhythm of time. Festivals, offerings, ceremonies, beneath the moon. Let us now follow the scent of incense and the flicker of red silk banners into the spiritual life of the wall. Festivals, prayers, and duties. Beyond the stones and the schedules, beyond the taxes, towers, and tired soldiers, there lived something quieter. A heartbeat of belief, a rhythm older than the empire itself. For while the Great Wall was raised by order and enforced by command, it was sustained day to day by ritual, ceremonies, offerings, and simple acts of reverence stitched meaning into the stones. Tonight, we walk not as laborers or guards. We enter the subtle realm of the sacred. Imagine now a pale morning at a small outpost along the wall. The sun rises slowly, golden and diffused. Soldiers stand in neat rows. Before them, a small altar carved from stone, smoothed by generations of hands. An incense stick flickers gently, a bowl of rice. It was also a place of reflection, because to live on the edge, to stand against the horizon, day after day, required more than strength. It required belief, no priest, just the quiet murmur of a captain reading a short prayer for protection, before patrols through dangerous terrain, before winter's first frost, carried from home or made in simple molds. On the edge of the frontier, soldiers gathered atop the wall to gaze at the moonfall, bright, distant. Some whispered wishes aloud. He would check the oil, measure the hay bundles, and ensure that everything needed for a signal fire was in place. Though the wall was a structure of war and worry, the rituals were simple, grounded in old traditions that long predated the Ming. Rice, wine, steamed buns, and coins were left in small hollows built into the wall's side. He would sweep the altar space, replace old incense sticks, and see that offerings were respected. Lanterns were hung atop towers, swaying softly in the wind, their glow visible for miles in the cold, dark. Dumplings were made from precious flour stores, often shaped like coins to invite prosperity. In some places, in others, bundles of dried herbs were burned, the smoke curling into the stones as if asking the wall to remember its purpose, particularly among soldiers stationed near their native provinces. Though far from the grand city celebrations, these frontier observances carried weight. On the Lunar New Year, soldiers painted red marks on doorways and posted calligraphy scrolls around barrack gates. During the Mid-Autumn festival, the burning of old talismans and a brief moment of silence for fallen comrades. And then there were the ritual duties. Each watch post had designated roles beyond combat. One soldier might be assigned as fire tender, responsible for keeping the beacon wood dry and prepared. Another might be the ritual keeper assigned to maintain the small shrine that most towers hosted. Some honored the god of war, Henidal Guanju, with his long beard and unwavering gaze. The tower bells would ring softly. Children raised beside the wall. Scrolls of protection might be read aloud, old verses meant to ward off misfortune. Sometimes, in the quiet, the wind seemed to pause with them. Others honored Tudi Gong, the local earth, spirit guardian of ground and soil. Still others were dedicated to ancestral spirits. The rituals were not formal state religion. They were practical, heartfelt, born of need. In moments of danger, men turned to the divine. Before a storm, before a journey across unknown hills, a small prayer might be whispered. Let my feet return to this wall. Let the wind be silent. The shadows stretch. A soldier kneels briefly at the tower's corner, pressing 2 fingers to the earth. He mutters a name not his own. Let the gods who watch stones also watch me. There were group ceremonies. Once a season, officers gathered their men for a cleansing rita, symbolic washing of hands and faces in cold water. And during solar eclipses or strange sky omens, a halt would be called. Soldiers would assemble. The walls that did not hold we leave this sacred space behind. Even the act of climbing the tower was, for some, a kind of ritual. Each soldier had his own steps, his own rhythm, his own moment of pause at the top. Others saluted the horizon before settling into their watch. Little gestures, but full of meaning. In many parts of the wall, farmers who lived nearby offered produce during harvest festivals, setting out baskets of pears, apples, and dried corn for the garrison. The wall itself began to take on a kind of personality. It was protective, but demanding. It was admired, but feared. It was part of the landscape, but never just scenery. Poets, one wrote, by day it watches, unblinking, the curve of the plain. By night, it whispers stone thoughts to the wind, a thing of men, yet touched by gods. Imagine now, if you will, the close of a day, the sun drops low. There is no audience, no reward, only ritual, only the rhythm of belief, as we drift now toward the cracks. In that belief the failures, in our next part, we gently confront the wall's limitations, its inefficiencies, its symbolic power, and the moments when stone was not enough. The wall stands, sturdy, and walls, no matter how long, do not always hold. In this final part of our segment, where the wall so solid, not only the physical ones, but the quiet fractures in purpose, in belief, in legacy, let us begin with what the wall could not do. Despite the grandeur of the Ming reconstructions, the carefully measured bricks, the towers spaced with military, it was built not to stop invaders entirely, but to slow them. They found the weaknesses places, where the wall ended at a cliff, where the towers were unmanned, or newly organized tribes, like the Oirat, too many stretches vulnerable to time, not with battering rams or siege engines, but with speed, mobility, timing, and even in this, it sometimes failed. Throughout the Ming dynasty, steppe raiders they Mongol remnants, they did not attack the strongest gates. In such moments, the wall's length, records speak of raids where the beacon fires were lit too late, or not at all, of towers that saw the enemy, of commanders bribed into silence. Sometimes, the wall simply watched the enemy ride by, and yet, it still stood, still held meaning, but it still symbolized protection. This was the paradox of the wall in its mature years. It did not always function well, but also curfews and suspicion, better treaties, more internal reform. It was not invincible, but it was enduring. In the Ming court, debates about the wall were frequent. Some ministers saw it as a waster relic of old fears, a chain that strangled trade and diplomacy. They argued for investment in mobile cavalry. Others believed in its importance, of towers overrun with weeds and goats, rather than soldiers. The wall was a line that declared imperial presence. To abandon it would be to invite collapse. This division echoed beyond court politics. For the peasants and townsfolk who lived near the wall, it was both guardian and burden. It brought soldiers and protection, but also taxes. It brought trade to border markets. To some, it was a comfort. To others, a cage. Life on the wall was hard, cold winters, meager rations, endless waiting. Some grew lax. Some abandoned their posts entirely. There are reports of garrisons failing to light their fires, of watchmen asleep at the ramparts. Stone, like spirit, can wear down, and in time, the wall began to fade from priority. Late in the Ming era, rebellion and financial strain, sections fell into disrepair. The lime mortar cracked. As old as the bricks, nature reclaimed what man could no longer maintain. And then came the Great Collapse in the early 17th century, and the Manchu invasion from the north pushed the Ming to its breaking point. It was an idea. The wall, in these final hours, stood as before, cold, tall, but it could not stop the shift. When the gates at Shanghai Pass were opened not by force, but by betrayal, the wall was bypassed entirely. The Manchus entered, not over stone, but through politics. The Qing dynasty began, and still the wall stood. Even when its military function faded, poets wrote of its endurance. Artists painted it winding like a dragon across the land. Common people spoke of it in metaphors. As patient as the wall, it was no longer merely a structure. The wall had become something larger than purpose. It had become memory, and in memory, to matter. Even today, a marker of ambition, we follow the path of time into the present, a witness to silence. Imagine now walking a ruined stretch of the wall. A tower slumps into itself, its cornerstones tilting slightly. No soldiers, no fire, only sky, only wind. You place your hand on a fragment of stone. It is warm from the sun, and in that warmth, you feel the pulse of centuries. The wall is flawed, but it remains. And now, as we prepare to leave behind the imperial past, we move toward the wall's modern echoes, the forgotten towers, the folk songs, the tourists who walk upon a structure they think they understand, to the wall not as it was but as it remains, quiet, distant, enduring. The wall today and yesterday, but it no longer shouts, it whispers, not in the roar of armies, but in the rustle of dry grass, the soft crumbling of stone, the wind slipping through empty towers. We leave behind the wall as structure and strategy in this final stretch of our journey. Imagine now a section of the wall rarely seen, not the wide, clean stretches crowded by tour groups, not the bold stone path near Beijing's edge, where cable cars glide and visitors sip bottled water on polished steps. No, we go further. Here, the wall is not restored, it is worn. The bricks are broken, the battlements are uneven. A tree grows through a gap in the parapet. Roots stretch into lime and soil. A lichen green crust spreads slowly over brick. You are alone here. The path ahead bends around a hill and vanishes. Below, the land rolls gently, unbroken, as it did long before the first basket of earth was lifted. This is the wall's true state now, less a line, and more a trace. Time reclaims what empire once held. Sections of the old Han wall, once strong and carefully maintained, have collapsed into the loess. In dry regions of Gansu and Inner Mongolia, earthen ridges, once tall, are now faint undulations in the sand, their outlines only visible from above like the veins of something long buried. In the rainy regions of the east, small plants grow where men once stood guard, water pools in the low places. Winter cracks widen each spring. The wall is not crumbling quickly, but it is crumbling, and still there is life. Birds nest in watchtower eaves. Foxes sleep in old barracks. Shepherds lead goats through forgotten gates. Villagers walk along the parapets at dusk, not in reverence, but routine. To them, the wall is not history. It is background. It is there just as it has always been. Used to build homes, repair paths, raise fences. Officials discourage it. But for many, practicality outweighs preservation. A stone is a stone. Elsewhere, small restoration efforts appear. Local volunteers, archaeologists, heritage workers quietly collecting debris, reinforcing walls with modern methods. No grand announcements, just hands and brushes and care, a different kind of labor. And in yet other places, the wall has simply disappeared, paved over by highways. Its absence is a presence of its own, a gap where something immense once stood. But not all is loss. In the minds of those who walk in the footsteps pressed gently into centuries-old stone, in the pause people feel when they first see it stretch across a horizon, a stillness, a sense that here something was built not for a day or a decade, but for time itself. It also lives in the season. In spring, vines creep up its sides, green against grey. In summer, cicadas. In autumn, leaves drift onto the steps, one by one. And in winter, snow settles along the wall, like a quilt softening its lines. It simply endures. It has watched dynasties rise and fall. It has watched languages change, customs fade, beliefs transform, and still, now imagine standing there at one of these quiet, no signpost, only you, the stones beneath your feet, and the wind. It is not cold, it is not even particularly impressive, and yet, because here, where the wall fades into hill and sky, it becomes something else. A boundary, yes, but also a memory, a question, a monument, not just a protection. This is not the wall of armies, the wall of moss and wind. As we step forward, in the next part, 2 folk songs, sayings, and the stories passed down by those who never studied history but lived in its shadow. Let us walk now from stone to sound, but in mouths. The Great Wall of China, a name that stirs visions of vastness, of ancient orders. But now, at the end of this quiet walk through time, the wall feels different, softer, quieter, more human. We began in the misty borderlands, long before the wall was a line, whose hands tamped the wall's earliest form into place, whose names were never written down, but whose efforts endure in dust and brick, when the rhythm of life moved with flocks and fields, not battlements, afraid not only of invasion. We followed the first hints earth embankments, raised by wary kingdoms, where life moved without borders, more deeply tied to the paper systems of state than to stone alone. And the wall was something to watch, sometimes to cross, but we stood with the conscripted, patrols with no alarms, hearths warmed by millet and memory. We wandered the garrisons and the farms through seasons of waiting. We listened to the tailies whispered in watchtowers, the footsteps heard but never seen. We rode beyond the wall into the breath of the steppe. We watched the wall rise higher, in the Ming more ordered, more solid. We saw rituals wrapped around bricks, prayers offered to empty air, and the slow realization that no wall is ever complete or truly unbreakable. And we walked its decline, not in destruction, but in quiet. Watchtowers that watch only the stars now, but to what lies beneath them. Songs sung, and finally we stood where tourists now stand and listened not to their footsteps. This wall so vast, it can be seen from the sky, was never built for the gods. It was built by people, for people, and in people. In every family that traces its roots to the northern frontier, in every folk song still hummed under the breath, in every grain of dust that slips between ancient bricks as the wind moves through yet again. The Great Wall does not speak, but if it could, its voice would not be loud. It would be slow, measured, steady, like footsteps on a frost-covered path, like a story told at dusk for the 10th time because the children ask for it once more. Because it's comforting, because it's familiar, because it still matters. So now, as we close our eyes on this journey, let the wall fade, let it sink below the horizon of thought, a quiet presence, and let the world it watched over, with all its rhythms and whispers, rest with you tonight. You are far from its stones, but perhaps not so far from its silence. Good night, and thank you for walking with us.